Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, What Life Was Like in the Industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I'm your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Como. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks, streets, and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the German Reformed Church.
Okay, we're going to talk about the German Reformed Church, which means, when you say that phrase, it means the Calvinist Church. There was a Lutheran Protestant movement, and then that happened, of course, mostly in Germany. And then there's a Calvinist Protestant movement, which mostly happened in Switzerland. And I think it's a stricter interpretation of the denomination. So we're going to talk about this church, and we're also going to talk about exactly what that German Reform means, and how the church has changed through the years, and whether there's improvements inside of it. Okay, so to find this church, it's on the top of Elm Street, where it crosses Sargent Street at the northeast corner of that intersection. And it's still there. It's not called that anymore, of course. And it's now at this point, I think, Evangelical Church, but at some point it changed over from German Reformed into the St. Andrew's Reformed Church. So it had a different name for a long time. Now the official front of the church faces onto Elm Street, and you can tell that there is a side door that looks bigger and it faces Sargent, but you can tell that because the long row of stained glass windows is on Sargent Street itself, but the steeple at the front of the church with a big rose window up top are on Elm Street. And so keep that in mind. Now in 1961, something happened where it united with the First Congregational Church of Holyoke to become the First United Congregational. Right, so it's still there, and it's under a different group's name now. And its building itself is still in great shape. We'll talk about that. But in the cornerstone, you can see the date. It's from 1891. All right. So for 70 years, it stayed independent, have a Reformed church, a German Reformed church, even though it changed its name to St. Andrew's. And that's great. And I like this church. It's small, but it has a pretty look to it.
And what does German Reformed mean?
All right, so Martin Luther revolted against the Catholic Church in Europe and Germany, and he started up a Protestant denomination, now called the Lutheran denomination. And from there, it mushroomed or exploded. So there's many Protestant denominations, and only a very few Catholic ones. Now, what has happened is that there's so many divisions, and it's hard to keep track of, but the Calvinist line is mostly called the German Reformed Church. And it's a stricter denomination within the Lutheran denomination. So there is a Lutheran church in Holyoke. It used to be down in South Holyoke. It's not there anymore, and it's moved up to Northampton Street. But this Calvinist line was mostly from Germans, but it was started by John Calvin, who was from Switzerland. So it's a very important division, and there's now many branches of Protestantism. There's the Congregationalists, the Baptists, Anglicans, Evangelicals, Episcopals, and many divisions among those even. So it's really hard to keep track of who believes what and so forth.
And really quick, before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, if you want to sign up for more information or any of his various tours, you can check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. And there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops on each of his tours, as well as photos and text of the historical sites throughout as well. And for private tours and other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, @yahoo.com. And his tours make for fun, educational, outdoor activities for families and group partners. So, getting back to our interview, how has the church physically changed through the years?
All right, now physically changed, not too much. So what you're looking at is what you would have seen in 1891. And on my website, I have a page for every church, and it has pictures of this church in the old time, and in particular has a postcard of it, and it looks very much the same. So there's not much change going on. What has happened is it's got an old look to it. It's 133 years old now, so that old look has stayed the same. It still has a slate roof. It still has a Gothic Revival architectural style. It still has stained glass. The front door looks very similar. So not much has changed even after all these years. So they've maintained it very well. One thing they have put is a handicap accessible ramp, and that goes up along its front left side. And that's what confuses a lot of people, that the front door is on Elm Street, not on Sargent, even though the front door on Elm Street is smaller than the one side door on Sargent Street. And it's a bit obscured by the wrought iron fence and the handicap accessible ramp. But otherwise, they've done a great job in keeping up this church.
And is there any improvements that you might need?
Well, none I can think of, but if they do need one, the CPF Holyoke Community Preservation Act grant would be able to help them out. One thing that they could use is they could make sure that the mortar between the brick is staying in place. In some places, it's starting to get loose. So that's one tiny thing. And then the slate roof is starting to get discolored, especially on the steeple. So they could brush that up or somehow put some kind of material to get it back to its pure black look. Otherwise, what I'm looking at is a pretty stable church. And it's hard to believe it's 133 years old and still looks the same. So keep that in mind when you do look at it. And it's well worth the visit. And inside it has a nice look. Because of that stained glass, there's a nice look on it, especially since the stained glass towards the south is going to get a lot of sun. So during the masses, it looks quite beautiful. So visit it, and I hope that you compare it to other churches around the area, other churches around Holyoke. It's a small one, but it's a powerful punch for a little place.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of expertise. And we want to thank our listeners for tuning in. And you can check out a large selection of other podcasts on his website. Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, What Life Was Like in the Industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I'm your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Camus. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks, streets, and selected historical houses within each community. Seeing the German Evangelical Lutheran Church. So, where was this church originally located?
It was in South Holyoke. A lot of the Germans in Holyoke lived in South Holyoke or in Springdale. And it was located officially on Jackson Street. And it was in the triangle formed by Jackson, Southbridge, and Park Streets. And Park Street is now called Clementi Street. That triangle is now a park. And so There's nothing there. But in that triangle, there used to be the Hamilton Street School, there used to be the Rodfi Shalom Synagogue, and there used to be the German Lutheran, Evangelical Lutheran Church. That was at the end of the triangle where it comes to a point. All right, and if in the beginning it was a wooden church with wooden floor, and this wooden church came around in 1867. All right, and we're going to talk about the history of that church coming up, and we're also going to talk about its two churches that spawned off it that still exist within Holyoke. And it had a competitor within Holyoke that you should also check out its page. It was called it was a Calvinist church. It was called the German Reformed Church. All right, so we're going to talk about this one today in its history. But every church in Holyoke, I have a webpage for it. And this one, it has a link to the nice story about it, someone written. And it has 3 pictures of it that other people have taken, either in photograph form or postcard form. And they're on links. So if you click on any one of those 3 links, you get to see what that church looked like. Now, I'm mostly talking about the next church that came around, because the original wooden clad church burned to the ground. We'll talk about during the history part.
And what is the history of that church?
All right, it started off at a wooden clad church in 1867. All right, and it stayed that way until 1899 when it burned to the ground. All right, I have a picture of that original church. So that's one picture that I didn't mention. I mentioned the other church that came around next. I have 3 pictures for that, and that's what I mentioned. Now, the Masonry Church was built in 1899 after the other one burned down. And that one, check out all the pictures, and they're quite nice. And that one has an expanded story that someone wrote about it. Now, the most famous pastor of all of this church is August Brunn. His last name is spelled Brunn. And make sure you read about it. Make sure you look at all the maps I have about it. Because the church is gone, the area has changed so drastically, it's hard to believe there used to be so much around that area. It used to be a German section, and in front of it, the French-Canadian section. So you had a lot happening in this little place. And we're going to talk about the 2 churches that spawned out of it, because even it ended up moving.
And really quick, before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, if you want to sign up for private tours or other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, capital B, @yahoo.com. And this tour is made for fun, educational, outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview, at what location is the First Lutheran Church?
It's on Northampton Street, approximately where you would see the back of the Holyoke Hospital complex. And it's also next to the Rodfi Shalom Synagogue, which is no coincidence because the Rodfi Shalom and this wonderful German Evangelical Lutheran Church were always within 100 feet of themselves, and they still are. So they both moved up to near the same location on Northampton Street and 4 Avenue. Now, this one is the replacement for the one that was in South Holyoke. It's changed its name over to the First Lutheran Church. It probably was built about 1945 or so, and I have to look that up to be sure. It's now built up in the neoclassical style, and its congregation is still the one that started out in South Holyoke. And it has a school associated with it nowadays that's quite active. They have about 100 students going there for a day school. Plus they have a Sunday mass schedule, and they have Sunday school for other students. So it's a very, very active place, and that's wonderful to see.
And where is the St. Peter's Lutheran Church?
That is on Jarvis Avenue towards the end, very close to East Hampton Road. I'm guessing that one came around sometime in the very late 70s, early 80s. It's a modern looking church and it has a steeple on the outside. I do not know where that one emanated from. Did it come out of the Calvinist church in Holyoke? So I have to figure out the whole history of that one still. But there's still two Lutheran churches in Holyoke. There has been from the 1890s. So that's a wonderful sight to see that they're still very active around the area.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your chores and historical topics of expertise. And we want to thank our listeners for tuning in. And you can check out a large selection of our other podcasts on his website